So we are very, very pleased to bring to you someone most of you have never heard of before, Warren Stutt. Warren has a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science with honors. And what that means is that it's not just a special designation, but he spent 4 years getting his degree because he studied extra material rather than the usual 3 years. He's very educated in that discipline. From 1989 to 2000, he was a computer programmer and information technology support person for a point-of-sale system for a large nationwide retailer. And by the way, he's from New Zealand. He got his degree from Auckland University. From 2009 to the present, he assisted other programmers around the world with flight data recorder decoding. From 2014 to the present, he customized an FDR flight data recorder file decompressor, and he wrote a flight data recorder file format converter for an avionics engineer. Warren will discuss today the data from the flight data recorder of American Airlines Flight 77 and how he was able to decode it. He will also address the question of the authenticity of the data. If the file is authentic, it supports the claim that the impacting plane was actually American Airlines Flight 77. So, as a computer scientist, Warren, in 2007, became interested in the flight data recorder of American Airlines Flight 77. When he read an analysis of the data by Pilots for 9/11 Truth, this analysis seemed to indicate that the plane came in too high on its final approach to be able to hit the Pentagon. One anomaly he saw in the data was that it seemed to end at a clean time boundary, whereas he would have expected that in the case of a crash, the data would probably end midway through a data line. This led him to believe that there was probably more data in the raw binary file than was read by the decoder. He became intrigued, and he realized that he potentially had the tools to investigate this further. He also corresponded with John Farmer, who was analyzing the radar track of the plane, and from his research suspected that there was 4 to 6 seconds of missing data. So motivated by all this, Warren set about figuring out how to decode the raw binary file, which ended up taking him 2 years of sleuthing. He succeeded and found more than 4 seconds of additional data in the raw file, and this 4 seconds brought the plane all the way down to the opening in the Pentagon wall. There is probably no way to make Warren's talk completely understandable to everyone, but everyone should realize that the FDR contains a highly complex and interrelated set of data that would be difficult to fabricate. This is not something that we should casually set aside. So we have a very special person with us today, all the way from New Zealand, where they speak not American English, but Kiwi. If you're a programmer, a lot of his talk may make sense to you. Otherwise, welcome to the world of data frames, Huffman coding, Hamming codes, and parity errors. Please help me welcome Warren Stutt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the flight data recorder from Flight 77, how I came to decode data from it, and why I believe the data is authentic, and how the data supports American Airlines Flight 77 impacting the Pentagon. I have a background in computer programming. A number of Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, requests to the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, were made from both inside and outside of the US. The data was released in three forms: an animation, a CSV file, which is a type of spreadsheet, and a raw FDR file. Various requests resulted in all or some of these. I made a FOIA request for my own copy of the raw FDR file and specifically requested the data frame layouts, which they sent. The details are on my website. My interest in the flight data recorder for Flight 77 started when I read about the claim by Pilots for 9/11 Truth, or P4T, that the last pressure altitude of the data showed the aircraft was too high to hit the Pentagon. Also, P4T noted that based on a different decode, the radio height data appeared to confirm this. This decode had one less row than the first decode, and both of them ended with complete rows of data rather than with a partial row that I was expecting to see since the plane crashed. The raw binary FDR file that these decodes were based on was publicly available. Since something appeared to be missing, I decided I would attempt to decode the raw FDR file myself. Now I'll talk about how I decoded the last data frame, and I discovered that the last data frame contained almost 4 seconds of additional data. This is the memory map of an L3 Communications FA2100 FDR, which was the make and model of the FDR that was in Flight 77. And here I've highlighted the flight data page with this red rectangle here. The Hamming code and page parity for each page is stored at the end of each of the page as shown above. You see this little rectangle here. If a single bit in the flight data page was corrupted after it was written, the Hamming code and page parity can be used to reliably find and correct it. If 2 bits in the flight data page were corrupted, the Hamming code and page parity can be used to reliably detect but not correct them. If more than 2 bits of the flight data page were corrupted, the Hamming code and page parity cannot reliably find and correct the errors and may actually add another error. Here is an ordinary flight data page, which is the individual bits in the flight data page are represented by these 1s and 0s. And at the end here, we have the very last bit is the page parity bit, and the 10 bits which I've highlighted in red before that are the Hamming code. And here is the last page from a normal flight. We can see how it starts with 1s and 0s, and then you see this long string of 1s, which is blank data. However, at the end of the page, we still see a valid Hamming code and page parity bit recorded. And here is the end of the second to last frame of Flight 77. The Hamming code and page parity bit were never recorded, so they were both left as all 1s, which you can see down here. By chance, this all 1s Hamming code was consistent with this parity error, so the decoding program attempted to repair the data, which ended up corrupting this frame. And here is the end of the last frame of Flight 77. Again, the Hamming code and page parity bit were never recorded, so they were both left as all 1s. By chance, 1 is the correct parity bit, so there is no parity error. This was interpreted by the decoder program as there being more than 1 bit error, so it decided the page was unreliable and discarded the whole frame. I was able to read the last 2 data frames 2 different ways. One was by ignoring the Hamming code and page parity and simply reading the data. The second way was to insert the correct Hamming code and page parity. This allowed the standard software to decode the data correctly. Both methods were in agreement, which confirms that that was the source of the errors. Now I look at why the Hamming code and page parity bit was not written. Here is a picture of an intact L3 Communications FA2100 FDR. The vertical orange cylinder here is the memory module. And here is the memory module of the FDR as found at the Pentagon. Note that it is detached from the rest of the FDR. Here are photos from the NTSB FDR report showing the memory module before and after it was removed from its outer case. The FDR data is recorded in 2 flight data streams as shown on the right. There's one here, labelled Flight Data Stream 0, and one here labelled Flight Data Stream 1. Frames of data are alternately written back and forth between the 2 streams. The memory module was ripped away from the rest of the FDR before the Hamming code and page parity could be written for the final page in each stream. This would be like removing a memory stick from a computer without properly ejecting it. The longitudinal acceleration, which is speeding up or slowing down, is recorded 4 times per second. As can be seen in the graph, the values of the last 4 seconds vary between about 0.01 and 0.21, which is accelerating, before suddenly dropping to minus 1.083, which is decelerating. This is the maximum negative value that the FDR can record, as would be expected for an impact. Now we'll address claims that the FDR data is not authentic. I'd like to quote some comments by my late colleague Frank Legge that I agree with. Of course, it can be argued that the FDR file was fraudulently manufactured and not the result of the flight of AA-77. The difficulty of such manufacture is immense. There are hundreds of parameters being recorded all the time during a flight. Some are recorded once per second, some more often, some less. All these must be coordinated with one another. If the pilot pulls back on the control column, this must be accompanied by an alteration of elevator angle and followed by an increase of pitch. This in turn must be followed by an increase in altitude and a recording of upward acceleration, and must also be followed by a reduction in speed or an increase in power. This is just the tip of the iceberg of complexity, and of course it must start and finish at the right location and altitude. The probability of creating such a masterpiece from scratch correctly must be virtually non-existent. Now here is a photograph taken by the NTSB of the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, from Flight 77. And as you can see, it's severely damaged, and the NTSB said that no data was recoverable from it. So if something had happened to Flight 77 that someone was trying to hide, couldn't we have just been shown a similarly damaged flight data recorder, and with the claim that the data was unreadable from it? That would be much easier to do, surely, than faking the data. P4T claims that it is unprecedented for the FDR serial number to be missing from an NTSB report. However, FDR serial numbers do not appear in the following NTSB reports for other incidents, including this in-flight left engine fire of American Airlines Flight 1400 on September the 28th, 2007, this runway overrun by American Airlines Flight 268 on September the 22nd, 2008, and this collision between 2 aircraft during taxiing on June the 30th, 2004. P4T has claimed that the creation date of the FDR file was before the FDR was reported to be found, therefore calling the authenticity of the data into question. However, 4 copies of their file, as received in response to different FOIA requests, have varying dates as shown below. Some are years later. Therefore, the dates depend on the computers that were used to make the copies. There is no guarantee that those dates are times are correct. Most importantly, the contents of all 4 files are identical. P4T has claimed that there are always fields in the header of any real FDR file that contains the aircraft ID. This is simply false. I have multiple examples of FDR files from different aircraft and different sources that do not contain aircraft ID in the header. On the left here is the text header from the American Airlines 77 FDR, and over here on the right is the text header from another FA2100 FDR. Note that neither text header has tail number, aircraft ID, fleet ID, or any other fields that could be used to identify which aircraft the FDR data is from. The fact that there are many previous flights in the FDR file is more evidence that it is authentic. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, required that at minimum the last 25 hours of flight data be stored for this type of aircraft. The FDR data actually contains more than 42 hours of data, which covers the end of one flight and 10 more complete flights before the final flight. And here is the graph of pressure, altitude versus time for all flights in the FDR file, plotted by my co-panelist David Chandler. And here we can see the end of one flight as it descends down to the airport and then takes off again, cruises here, and then descends again to the next airport. So we can actually count the flights here, the partial flight, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 complete flights, and then the final flight at the end. And here are flights reported by American Airlines to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, or BTS. And so here we can see the date of the flight, the code for the airport that the plane took off from, the time that it took off, the airport code from where the plane landed, and the time it landed. And this is similar data derived from the FDR. The final flight is not in the BTS data because it took off but did not land. The takeoff and landing times for the previous flights derived from the FDR are consistent with the data that American Airlines provided to BTS. The flights travel between major US civilian airports, namely Chicago O'Hare, Orlando, Los Angeles and Washington Dulles, as would be expected from a large commercial airliner. The FDR file has over 1,100 parameters. The NTSB decodes only 346 of these. Some of the others are not functional, others are simply ignored by the NTSB. An example of a parameter that was clearly not functional is shown below. So this is supposed to be the static pressure, which is the a pressure outside of the aircraft, but this data has shows a supposed pressure going from 300 to 1,000 and then down to 0 and then going up to 1,000 again, and cycling between these extreme values on a regular basis. So this is clearly not a real measurement of static pressure, so this data is clearly invalid. The flight deck door is the door between the main cabin and the cockpit of the aircraft. The flight deck door parameter is another example of a non-functional parameter. P4T has claimed that since the flight deck door parameter in the FDR data has the value closed during the entire flight, then hijackers could not have entered the cockpit because they never opened the door. On the right is data from a period of time of less than a minute where the engines were turned on then off. This was likely done by an engineer who would not have needed to have closed the flight deck door because there would be no passengers on the aircraft. And here we can see the end of one flight at GMT 1:32. You can see the GMT hours and minutes columns there. And then there's a gap of about 5.5 hours here to 7:02 GMT. And then less than 20 seconds of data here, which would have been when the engines were turned on and off briefly, which would have turned the FDR on and off. And then a gap of another more than 7 hours until the start of the next flight. So the important thing to note here is that the flight deck door shows closed throughout this entire time, even during the period when it wouldn't need to be closed. P4T has claimed that the FDR data should show the location of the plane at gate D26 at Dulles International Airport at the start of the flight rather than the location away from the terminal. However, previous flights in the FDR data also start away from departure gates. The aircraft was equipped with equipment that could be used to automatically update the location during flight, but when taxiing on the ground, the position information drifted off. And here we have the location of the aircraft according to the FDR, plotted as these grey and white circles here. And here, these yellow and green and red circles are locations of the plane as reported by radar. So what we can see here is there's an offset between the two sets of data here, but as during the flight, the FDR location is corrected by the equipment on board the aircraft, the FDR locations are brought into line to match the radar data. The GPS parameter is in the FDR data has the value OPER, or operational, as opposed to INOPER, or inoperational. P4T has asked why this value would indicate that the GPS was operational when the aircraft was not equipped with GPS. The GPS time parameters have values that jump around, and so GPS was not installed, and so the GPS parameter that indicated OPER was not functional. The recorded location was corrected during flight, which also indicates that the plane used inertial rather than GPS navigation. P4T argued that the data frame layout that is used for decoding FDR data, which was supplied by American Airlines, must be correct because they have customised it for their aircraft. They argued that since the data frame layout did not correctly decode the FDR data, that the FDR data is not authentic. However, the NTSB found other instances where American Airlines supplied formulas that were incorrect for certain parameters. During the initial readout of the FDR, the conversion equation for the rudder pedal position parameter was found to be incorrect. Thus, the FDR data had to be examined to obtain reference data to establish the proper equation for the rudder pedal position parameter. And here is another example of incorrect FDR documentation supplied by American Airlines to the NTSB. In addition, during its investigation, the NTSB identified issues with American Airlines FDR system-related documentation, its FDR-related maintenance program, and the Federal Aviation Administration's oversight of that maintenance program. Specifically, although operators are required by federal regulations to maintain accurate documentation of their FDR configurations, American Airlines personnel could not provide appropriate documentation and/or wiring diagrams for the incident airplane's FDR installation. Now I'll address some other P4T claims. Starting with that, the radio height confirms that Flight 77 was too high to hit the Pentagon. Here I've plotted the radio height from the FDR data in blue on this blue line, and the elevation of the or altitude of the ground is this purpley coloured line or red line here, and the green line, which is the radio altitude, is the sum of those two plus another 12-foot adjustment to the bottom of the fuselage. The top of the Pentagon was about 113 feet above mean sea level, so I have plotted that as this horizontal purple line here. And you can see that the green line, the radio altitude, descends below that line which marks the Pentagon height, and you can see that it is continuously descending. So this data shows that it would have definitely have hit the Pentagon. It would not have been too high. P4T refuses to accept the last data frame that I recovered. And here, P4T points to the pitch angle shown here in the right-hand column and claims it to be that it is the final second of data. They are not taking the last 4 seconds of data into account. The actual pitch in the last second flattens out to minus 1.2 degrees, as shown in the green box on the right. Their data, that's shown in the red box, was recorded 4 seconds earlier. So you can see this animation from their video, it misses the light poles because they used the pitch angle that was too steep, so that the plane was not descending that steep in reality. P4T calculated an erroneous pull-up G-force of 10.14 G due to their claim that the pull-up occurred in a very short time interval, as highlighted in my co-panellist Wayne Costy's work. Their attack on the Pentagon video does not give a justification for the short time pull-up that they used. Above we can see the last 3 seconds of vertical accelerations recorded in the FDR data. Note that the maximum is 2.264 G. This is much less than P4T's calculation of 10.14 G. Results of much less than 10.14 G also have been obtained using different evidence by David Chandler, Wayne Costy, Frank Legge, and others. Now I'll show some graphs plotted from the FDR data. This graph is similar to one from a paper Frank Legge and I co-wrote, which shows radio altitudes in comparison with the terrain. So this blue curving line here is the calculated path of the aircraft, and these vertical lines here are the light poles that were hit by the plane. This line on the right here is the wall of the Pentagon, and this purple line here is the ground elevation, or the height of the ground above mean sea level. So all these heights are heights above mean sea level in feet. And this graph was plotted by co-panelist David Chandler from the FDR data, which highlights the erratic changes in altitude at the times when the autopilot was turned off. This section of data here, you can see, is quite wavy, and also this section of data here towards the end of the flight is also quite wavy, and the rest of the time the altitude changes a lot more smoothly. And this graph was plotted by Frank Legge from the FDR data and shows the final approach to the Pentagon involved an intention to maximise the impact. And here you can see the airspeed plotted in green here is ramping up here, increasing. You can see that the in blue here is the throttle lever angles, which is basically the controls to actually cause the plane to go faster. And this is also reflected in the fuel flow going into the engines as well. So in summary, my research found an extra 4 seconds of FDR data that was not previously decoded. I have addressed objections to the authenticity of the FDR data from P4T and others. I've refuted P4T's claims that Flight 77 was too high to hit the Pentagon, that the pitch angle was too steep, and that a 10.14 G final pull-up was required. Thanks for listening to my presentation.